Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I are back at it for our weekly chat. I am on the road in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, speaking at the Chippewa Falls Agricultural Conference. I'm on the road quite a bit over the next couple of weeks. I know that my producer, who's also confusingly named Jacob, is not going to like that I'm those of you who are looking at this on YouTube, that I'm in my workout clothes recording the podcast. But when you're on the road, you got to fit the workouts in when you can, and I'm all about authenticity. So when I have the time and I'm in my home office, I'm happy to put on the shirt. But right now you got me post-workout, post-yoga, but before I have breakfast and before I go over to the event venue to talk to these Wisconsin agricultural producers about how geopolitics is really going to mess up their life. And if you're in the ag space and you haven't seen me or you want to talk more about that, please get in touch. And if any of the things that we talk about in the podcast today, whether it's our wealth management services or our research, our insights, or you just want to talk about some of these important issues that we're covering, you can always email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. I try to reply to everything that comes in, and I think I do a decent job of it, although give me a little bit of time to get back to you as I'm on the road the next couple of weeks. So I think that's all I have. Take good care of each other, and I will see you out there.
All right, good morning, folks. I'm in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Rob, you're still in Paris, but we're both in French-named cities. Isn't that nice?
Good observation.
Thank you. That's why they pay me the big bucks as a geopolitical analyst. Are you having trouble with your cell phones? I woke up this morning to my wife sending me an email that, oh my God, cell phone service is down, and it looks like for tens of thousands of people using AT&T and T-Mobile and Verizon, cell services are down. I was wondering if that extended to across the pond.
Oh no, we're doing fine here. We don't have to deal with the U.S. infrastructure.
Well, I don't know. It sounds a little nefarious. I feel like I'm in that movie. I'm forgetting the name of the movie, but the one with Ethan Hawke and Mahershala Ali, where things start going weird and then suddenly it's the apocalypse. Did you see that one? I'm forgetting what it was. It was on Netflix. Anyway, I hope we're not going to figure out tomorrow that it's a North Korean Russian attack on U.S. infrastructure, and I won't be able to get home tonight. But that is on my mind. Where should we start? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. I thought we would start a little bit maybe with some micro geopolitics before we get into the macro, because as I said, I'm here in Eau Claire. I've been doing research for a presentation that I'm giving at the Chippewa Agricultural Conference this week. Happy to be there. What do you know about Eau Claire, Rob? Do you know anything about the town? I don't think it's big enough to be called a city.
I know zero, so I think start with that assumption and enlighten us.
Great, because I think it'll actually back into some things that we talk about here often. Well, first of all, how's your French? Do you know what Eau Claire means?
I do. I mean, hard to translate exactly, but why don't you tell us?
Okay. So those French classes not going so well. So clear water is roughly the translation of Eau Claire, or at least that's what Google tells me. And the French claim to have named it clear water because of the confluence of the Chippewa River with the Eau Claire. I think I might be getting that wrong. But really, it was the Native American tribe that used to be here. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering it, but it's the Ojibwe, I think. They used to call the river, the Chippewa River, the water that runs clear. So the French just stole the name and then put their name on it. And now everybody says it's a French name. But actually, it goes back to native names of things. This is often the case. It's also a really interesting part of the United States from sort of a geological perspective, which I didn't really know about. It's part of basically a driftless area. And it comprises parts of southwestern Wisconsin, southeastern Minnesota, some parts of northeastern Iowa. And you normally think of the Midwest as big and flat. But what happened in this little slice of the United States is that it was never covered by ice during the last ice age. So it lacks glacial deposits known as drift, and the landscape is actually characterized by steep hills and forested ridges and deeply carved river valleys. As you're sort of driving into Eau Claire, I drove in from Minneapolis, it feels like you're in sort of a completely different place than the rest of the Midwest, so that's sort of cool. And also, its geography lent itself to a lot of different industry. So its first major industry was, it's a French town, so they were trapping furs. That was the only thing the French seemed to want to do in early North America. But eventually it gets the moniker of Sawdust City because it has tons of forest, and it becomes one of the real lumber capitals of the United States because it's producing all this lumber that goes everywhere else in the United States. And because the Chippewa feeds into the Mississippi, it can also go everywhere. Eventually they cut down all the trees, so the lumber industry goes away. But what happens is it becomes a center of the tire industry in the United States. So a guy named Raymond Gillette starts a big tire factory here in 1916 and 1917 called the Gillette Safety Tire Company, and eventually gets bought out by Uniroyal. And from 1917 to 1992, Eau Claire is one of the biggest hubs of U.S. tire production in the entire country. And then unceremoniously, around 91, 92, Uniroyal announces, in sort of a shock, if you can go read the newspaper articles from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and places like that at the time, they just decide to close down the tire factory. And I wanted to get into that a little bit because that's how this backs into geopolitics. The last little tidbit that I wanted to share with you is that Eau Claire is the horseradish capital of the United States as well. It is the largest grower and producer of horseradish in the United States. Now, apparently there is a city, or at least a town in southern Illinois called Collinsville, which is trying to usurp Eau Claire's role as the horseradish capital of the United States. They have even trademarked the moniker the world's horseradish capital. But I'm reading here from an article from a local Eau Claire publication that responds to this by saying, you don't need any sort of backing to do that. We could go out and trademark global capital of foot fungus in the world right now without any evidence. So some real shots fired and some real drama about horseradish here in the heart of the United States. So I'll pause there and let you ask any questions, but it's the tire conversation that I wanted to get into because the rise and fall of the U.S. tire industry is actually pretty interesting and gets into a lot of the sorts of things that we like to talk here. Tech innovation, how tech innovation changes industry, what globalization actually meant for workers in manufacturing, and also how it ties into the U.S.-China trade war. But before we get to those things, is there anything else you want to know from my fun facts about Eau Claire?
I don't know. Are you setting me up for a softball question here? Because if so, I'm not getting it. I mean, I want to hear about the tires.
You want to hear about the tires. Okay. And I forgot one thing. Eau Claire's also the home of Bon Iver. So I'm going to throw some Bon Iver clips in, or I'm going to tell Jacob to throw some Bon Iver clips in. By the way, now that I'm here, I understand him going off into a cabin in the middle of nowhere and writing the beautiful music and albums that he did. But we don't need to get into the role of Bon Iver's music in my life. So yeah, the tire industry. So there's actually the National Bureau of Economic Research put out an entire 50-page paper in the late 1990s about the eclipse of the U.S. tire industry. And it was a really interesting read, and I thought we could talk about it a little bit because it basically talks about the rise of the U.S. tire industry and the rise of the U.S. automobile, but that in the 1980s and in the early 1990s, the U.S. really gets displaced as a major tire producer and really exporter. It starts importing all of these tires from abroad. And the paper, first, it goes after the two most commonly ascribed reasons for the demise of the U.S. tire industry. The first is the one that you might expect, that foreign manufacturers were more efficient. David Ricardo's dream here, that free trade is the reason that we no longer make tires in the United States. Other countries were able to make them more cheaply. The United States was able to focus on, designing better cars, or, we get the rise of Tesla because we're no longer focusing on making the picks and shovels like tires inside of the United States. So that's one explanation. The second explanation that commonly got thrown around was a little bit more nuanced, and it was a textbook example, this paper calls it, of the third industrial revolution. And basically that rapid technological change created a lot of overcapacity and overinvestment in the tire industry. And that the cost of making tires got lower and lower and lower, and yet people were still spending the same amount of money, or they weren't modernizing things correctly. And it got to the point where somebody had to come in and basically slash a lot of the old infrastructure that was there, so de-invest in it in order to keep it profitable. And that the only companies that were willing to do that were outside raiders that were going to force these U.S. tire companies to either downsize to survive or exit. And that the fact that most of the people who bought up the U.S. tire companies were foreign companies rather than domestic didn't really have anything to do with that. It was more to do with the economics of tires in general. Now, as you might expect, the paper is going to dismiss both of those things. And it dismisses both of those things and actually focuses in on the tire industry itself and talks about how we moved in the world towards radial tires from bias ply tires. Now, maybe we need Matt McClintock on the podcast because I'm sure he could do this a lot better than I can. But basically, bias ply tires were the first tires. There's still some application for them if you're off-roading or if you're using big agricultural equipment. There is some advantage to using bias ply tires, but my understanding is they require a lot more rubber and they wear out a lot more easily. So you get this move to radial tires because it's a smoother ride, they don't wear out as quickly, and it's less rubber, so it's literally cheaper to produce them, and that's why everyone moves to radial tires. Everyone except the United States. So Michelin in France over there in 1948, they started producing radial tires in 1948. By 1970, 98% of Michelin tires in France were radials. And the rest of Europe and Japan followed sort of a similar path. That same year in 1970, when 98% of you Frenchmen are driving around with radial tires, only 2% of the tires sold in the United States were radials. So we were still stuck in this bias ply world. And it was, the infrastructure was there. Everything was set up to make bias ply tires. You would have needed a lot of capital expenditure and investment to change all of those manufacturing plots to move to radial tires. And Goodrich had tried it in 1965. It failed, in part because U.S. car manufacturers didn't like it. And it was only in the beginning of the 1970s that U.S. tire manufacturers were like, okay, we think this is a good idea. We don't want to be left behind with history. We're going to start doing these things. And the early 1970s, of course, is a terrible time to be doing major capex in the United States. You've got the big oil crisis, so people are afraid of cars and trying to economize there. You've got stagflation and everything like that. And so you have this position where the United States is getting more and more out of date, more and more sort of behind technologically, and that is the real reason that U.S. tire producers fell on their faces. And the last thing that I just want to tie it to here, now you can probably imagine the country that benefited the most from this was China. The data that I was able to find only went back to 1995, but from 1995 to 2021, the United States actually, its imports of tires only increased by 426%. Its exports actually increased by 140%. But China's exports of rubber tires from 1995 to 2021 increased by a whopping 3,570%. Similar figures for Thailand, which really cornered a market in the global tire industry. So those are the countries that really stepped in and made a big difference here. And one of the reasons, or I guess the last reason that I just wanted to tie this into what we're talking about, is because tires were actually a seminal moment for me in the U.S.-China trade war. Most people like to date the beginning of the U.S.-China trade war back to Trump's trade war against China, but to me, it actually really begins with U.S. President Barack Obama, and it begins in September 2009, because in that month, Obama gets on his desk a petition representing American tire workers, a union representing American tire workers, asking for tariffs on automobile and light truck tires imported from China. And Obama decides to put those tariffs on the books with executive action. A couple of years later, the United States International Trade Commission decides to extend those duties. China responds by imposing tit-for-tat tariffs on chicken meat into China. I like to call it the tire chicken war. In some ways, it's the real beginning of the U.S.-China trade war because the gloves are suddenly off. And it predates Xi Jinping and it predates Donald Trump. You can see the protectionism. You can see the inequalities of globalization bubbling to the surface. And it's interesting to me that it took from 1991 or 1992, when they're closing down tire factories in Eau Claire and people are going out of business, to, okay, now we're in front of the president in 2008, 2009. We need help. We need tariffs. We don't like this whole globalization thing. It wasn't actually good for us. So that's my little riff on tires. And I thought you might want to get into it a little bit because I don't know, it dovetails with a lot of the stuff that we talk about, how to deal with tech innovation, how to think about industries that are rising and falling, what is common knowledge today maybe isn't common always. The United States is not always at the technological forefront. Sometimes we were first at something, and in the business cycle, that means that at a certain point we're going to be way behind everybody else because we were so far ahead at first that we can't possibly imagine that there's a different way to do it. So take that any direction you want. Or tell me you want to talk about the rest of the world and thank me for the tire soliloquy.
Actually, let's talk about Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin instead of Eau Claire. No, there's a lot to go into there, both from a capital standpoint in terms of, sort of competition theory, but also from a technology and a geopolitics and a history standpoint. So I'll try to maybe explore some of them in turn. So what you're describing is sort of a recurring opportunity because Um, we wrote a piece on technology revolutions and investing recently that we can put the link in the show notes if we want. But this is one of the ideas that we explore, is this notion that old capital gets stuck. And for this reason, the majority of businesses are not well placed for technology revolutions. So if you look, and this is not going to be news to a lot of listeners, but if you look back to 1990, for example, and take the 500 companies in the S&P 500 at that time, the majority of them would do badly over the following generation. Between 1990 and 2021, 58% of all publicly traded stocks in the United States destroyed their shareholders' wealth. So they were down. A lot of them went to zero and destroyed all of the wealth. But 58% were negative during that time period, negative wealth creation. And all of the creation of wealth in the economy was concentrated in a really small minority of companies that had outsized wealth creation. And it wasn't just Amazon and Apple and Google and the IT companies that you think of. It was also Walmart, companies like that that were harnessing the technology revolution, in this case IT, to move on to bigger and better things. So that was the case in the US, and it's not just the US because the data shows that that's even more pronounced outside of the US. So this isn't just a story about the IT revolution in the US particularly, being so unique. This is a global phenomenon. This happens everywhere. So if you look at tires, right, this is a good example, that you gave with the radial tires and the technology change, because one of the kind of recurring themes of investing that we see over and over again is switching costs. When capital gets frozen into hard assets in the form of a factory or in the form of even a business model, it's very difficult to change out of that. So, for example, if you have a factory that does things in a certain way, there's an enormous amount of just operational risk in trying to change that way. So, to give an example, I think it was one of the trucking companies. Excuse me, I'm forgetting which one it was. It was Navistar. In the late 2010s, they made a huge bet on a new technology, a new combustion technology for their trucks, and it was a disaster, and it almost sank the company. And they were widely panned for doing this, and it went very badly. That's what happens when companies try to be more forward-thinking in the case like the tires. So historically, it's been, fraught with risk. And if you have your capital tied into an existing way of doing things, it's very difficult to get away from that and to take those risks. So what you tend to see is the kind of structure of capital across not only, within the US economy, but just the global economy, and even the way that cities look or the landscape looks is often a historical record of when was the capital formation first taking place, right? So like the US has a ton of factories and a ton of stuff that dates from sort of, the 1950s, 60s when we had capital, deployment accelerating. And since then, capital deployment, excluding like data centers and warehouses for all the stuff we're buying on Amazon, has been much lower. So we're not responding as quickly. As I said, you can even look at cities in this way. Like here I am in Paris. I'm surrounded by Haussmannian buildings from the 1870s. Why is that the case? Because of those unique historical circumstances, they decided to knock down all the old stuff and build all the new stuff. And the stuff has remained since then, since the 150 years. That's the frozen snapshot of Paris, just like New York is a frozen snapshot of the Art Deco period. And you can walk around and see the beautiful buildings. It's the same with factories and warehouses and business models in many ways.
My favorite example of this, to jump in for a second, is last year I was in Kansas City for a speaking event, and I drove up to St. Joe because my grandmother was born in St. Joe, Missouri, and I'd never been there, and I found her house, and that's a whole other different story. But St. Joe is also a really interesting little town because St. Joe was the end of the Pony Express. And the Pony Express was really important back in the day because that's how you got mail out to the Midwest or out to the West and things like that. And then the Transcontinental Railroad comes through. It's post-Civil War. We're building railroads all over the place. And St. Joe, it's like you froze it in time. You can imagine it like in 1868, it must have been the height of luxury, but it literally hasn't changed a bit since. And it's really weird to walk around downtown St. Joe because it feels like everything just stopped in 1868 with the Pony Express. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's the basic idea. So, architecture is such a great example of this because it's so tangible. You can walk around and see it. They just discovered a Stone Age era wall under the ocean. Did you see this? There was a piece in Nature this week that using sensor technologies, it's under the ocean now. They discovered a large mega structure, they called it, a wall that was built during the Stone Age for hunting purposes to channel animals into, a certain area. So, you can drive an hour from here and see a Roman era aqueduct, fully complete, just right in the middle of things. So this is not a new idea, but when you apply it to business, it explains a lot of this dynamic where certain companies are left behind. It's extremely difficult to tear things up and do something new once they're out there in the world. And in fact, if you look at someone like Clayton Christensen, who is the guru of creative disruption, and everyone knows his name, what people don't know is that in his writings, he actually counseled companies not to even try to change their business to adapt to disruptive new technologies. He suggested, do not try to change because it's so hard, you're going to fail. It's too risky. What he suggested was do a little startup business that just mimics the new thing. And then, kind of try to have a foot. And I mean, you can just sense how lame that suggestion is. And almost no one ever tries to do that. I can think of one specific example, which is Tempur-Pedic mattresses. When all of the online mattresses started in the mid-2010s, I mean, you could tell they were reading Clayton Christensen's, textbook because they were selling all their mattresses through stores. Then they started this stupid little startup business instead of changing the Tempur-Pedic. Anyway, we don't have to talk about mattresses now. We're talking about tires. But
no, what was the name of what was the name of the startup company?
I don't even remember now. It was never a success, but it was a shameless mimicry of like the Casper bed and the Tufted Needle bed that were being successful going directly online. But the point is, it's very, very difficult to change, and from a geopolitical standpoint, it also applies because when was China laying out all this capital? We said last week China's been throwing its treasure down a hole. Well, that's capital formation. It's been doing this very, very aggressively for the last 25 years. So, whether it's tires or whether it's EVs, there was someone on Twitter listed, the top valued EV companies in the world, and none of them were in Europe. And it was pointing out, well, why hasn't VW on this list? They dominated it for so long because VW had, its stuck way of doing things, and that's the natural progression of things. So follow where the capital formation is happening is the takeaway.
But I'm glad you mentioned China because that was one of the ways I wanted to backdoor into the geopolitics conversation because, we've talked about China a little bit and there were some interesting little tidbits this week. So some FDI data came out about China this week. It was FDI. So not just Chinese capital itself, but foreign capital has been going into China to create all these manufacturing complexes, urged on by Chinese policy, of course, to make it easy to do that. But still, it's a combination. It's not just China's putting the capital in, everybody's putting the capital in because they saw the opportunity. But FDI in China last year was $33 billion on a net basis. That's down 80% from the previous year, and it's 10% below the peak of FDI if you look at the chart in 2021. And there was an op-ed in Nikkei, a Japanese paper, that talked about how the levels are starting to look like they're sort of the same place they were when Deng Xiaoping initially called for reform and opening up in southern China in the early 1990s after Tiananmen. So China's sort of in this place, you're exactly right, where maybe the capital is drying up or they don't know where to push the capital. In the meantime, the two other interesting tidbits, China cut their 5-year mortgage rate by a record margin to try and aid the property sector. So from 4.2% to 3.9%. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's not normal for a 25 basis point cut from China. That shows you that maybe they're getting a little bit scared about the property sector. But on the flip side, it's the Lunar New Year holidays right now in China, or we're leading into them. And for the first time since COVID started, they're back above the pre-COVID levels. So they're at 2019 and above. So we can finally say, oh, here was the COVID aberration in China for consumption was 2020 to 2023. They're now at least consuming in terms of food and, whatever else you're going to buy on Lunar New Year, like they're consuming again. So maybe some signs of the Chinese consumer going, but a great example of what we're talking about because, I guess in 100 years, all of the architecture in China will look like whatever they're going to call 2010s architecture. I don't know. It's probably not going to look very nice, right?
Probably not. It's not going to be Osman, that's for sure. The FDI thing is just to begin there is interesting because there's often the misconception that China is dependent on foreign capital, like another emerging market. I think the FDI is probably more a reflection of fear on the part of foreign businesses. There was a long period, even after Chinese growth sort of peaked, which was in the 2011 period. We've kind of been coasting to a slower and slower rate since then, but there was still a lot of holdover enthusiasm about the Chinese consumer market. And, if only every middle class person in China would buy Lululemon pants, then, oh my God, that's $1 trillion or some market cap right there. And there are a few stories like that remaining, but you can just tell listening to what companies say that they're much more subdued and scared about that opportunity. And also because these things tend to be self-reinforcing. So every management team gets asked, or at least they used to get asked, well, what are you doing in China? Where's the growth opportunity in China? And the more people talk it up, the more pressure there is to have a strategy to do something. Are you opening stores? Do you have a joint venture partner? Whatever it may be. Now the whole narrative is obviously changing, where it's how are you protecting against China? How are you, worried about duplicating your supply chains so that you can continue to do business in China? And that's a very different dynamic. So you can see the tide is receding on that. But at the same time, China's not dependent on that capital. I think it's more symbolic than it is that China needs it, because the whole Chinese system, they have too much capital. That's the problem. Too much capital, not enough good stuff to do with it.
I agree with you that is the sentiment with U.S. China in particular, but also just companies in general wanting to go away from China. But I don't know if you noticed last week or the week before, everybody and their mom was making a big deal on social media and in newspapers about how Mexico had surpassed China as the biggest that Mexico had surpassed China as the United States' biggest trade partner. And this was seen as evidence, that decoupling is happening and we're doubling down on our relationships with our allies and we're moving away from China in the future. And everybody showed this really, really stark graph. I'll try to put a picture of it in the show notes that shows, here's total trade with Mexico surging above and the Chinese line well below it. And nobody thought to go pull the chart of Mexican imports from China, which is literally the missing chunk. It's not that we're decoupling at all. People can talk all they want and pay lip service to these things all they want. But to your point about change being really hard, you cannot snap your fingers and decouple. Anyone who's actually in business knows how hard it is to make that sort of change. So what's actually happening is stuff is coming through Mexico and into the United States. In the same way that German exports to Russia didn't stop. There, look at Kyrgyzstan's trade data. It looks like somebody was taking meth and was cooking the books, like it's all going through Kyrgyzstan or some of the other stands. So I think we're in this interesting place where the sentiment is one way and what people believe is happening is one thing, but the actual trade relations, it's like osmosis. Like the water is finding holes. It's getting through. Nothing is perfectly shut in. And that's one of the reasons the U.S. election is so interesting and so consequential, because Biden is a status quo politician. He would probably keep going with U.S. trade policy in this direction. Fairly predictable, more protectionist, but not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Where if you go to Trump 47, the website, and read some of the policies he's talking about blanket tariffs on everyone, not just China. And he's leaving the percentage sort of up to guessing at this point. But you can see that he's trying to articulate, and he had Lighthizer, I think, was out in the Wall Street Journal, did an interview this week talking about the ways that they would retool policy if they got a second administration, trying to close all those holes down and prevent those sorts of things from happening. And if that happens, like it's going to be a massive change. And don't think just because everybody wants you to think Mexico is the U.S.'s top trade partner that situation has actually changed at all.
Yeah, Michael Pettis points this out a lot, where he notes that people tend to look at trade in terms of bilateral relations, as you point out, but that's just not how it works, because the osmosis is in effect and supply chains are complicated and global. And I think the interesting thing, as you point out, is how is that going to be perceived, not what is the reality? Because the reality is nothing has changed in the Chinese system, in the Chinese current account surplus. In fact, it's larger than it's ever been, as we've discussed. So, using these measures that are targeted at one specific country just doesn't work. And to go back to the tire example that you gave previously, I remember, because we were doing detailed work around this, not in the Obama case, but later when Trump put tariffs on, I think it was in 2017. And what happened was they put very harsh tariffs on Chinese tires, and within 9 months, tire exports from Vietnam started to explode.
Right.
So guess where those were coming from? So it is a game of whack-a-mole.
And to your point, towards the end of the Trump presidency, I remember I got a call from one client whose name I can't mention. But at the very end of the Trump presidency, it was like he woke up one morning and got up on the wrong side of the bed, and the Commerce put out a press release that they were considering Vietnam as potentially a currency manipulator, and they were going to investigate Vietnam as a currency manipulator. And a lot of U.S. companies thought, oh, I'm going to de-risk China by moving to Vietnam. Apple's been doing that for years. A lot of the tech companies were thinking they were ahead of the game with Vietnam, and suddenly, it was all, and they didn't let it go through, and then Trump lost the election, and it kind of went away. But yes, I think we only saw in the first Trump presidency the trade war on China really deepen. If we get round two, if you believe the things that they're saying and the policy things that are coming out of not just Trump, but the people that would probably be in that administration, they're going to go after the Vietnams and the Frances and the Germanys and countries like that. And yeah, I mean, Vietnam is one of them. Thailand is like the big tire beneficiary. They've really focused on it. Vietnam, Thailand, and South Korea. But all of those are countries that if you had that sort of move towards protectionism, they would be the next line. And then the interesting question is, where do they go next? Does it actually reshore and we just get into this weird inflation spiral or deflation spiral because the prices get too high? Or do they move to other parts of the world that we haven't even thought about yet in terms of manufacturing these things? I don't know. That's like the third or fourth level of the chess game that I can't get to in my head.
Well, I think where this ultimately goes is that, I mean, right now we're sort of doing the normal playbook, which is targeted tariffs, targeted subsidies. And, as we said, that it doesn't work very well. Where that's ultimately going to go are broader scale interventions. And that means intervening with the currency. That is the big lever that does impact everything, no matter what. Intervening with capital flows. So the day that the United States comes out and says, hey, we don't want foreign countries buying as many treasuries, that's the day to really stand up and say, oh my God, the world is changing. because that is, the corollary of the U.S. coming out and saying, hey, we don't want our current account deficit to be, $110 billion every month. We decided that's a bad thing.
What do we do in our strategic wealth strategy if Trump comes out and says that on day one? Like, what's the stand up, and then what do we do?
It really depends, because so much of the strategic wealth strategy is about individual countries. Some of them will do great. Some of them will be absolutely screwed. And most of the ones that will be absolutely screwed, we currently are not in right now. So we have that sort of reflected already if it does indeed happen. I don't think we're nearly at that point yet, though. I don't think this is 2020's sort of event. But as things get worse, and by worse I mean, budget deficits, trade deficits, inevitably that releases itself through the sort of steam valve of currency. And this, just to make this a little more tangible and connect it to what's going on today in the news this week, why is that likely to happen? Well, we've already seen that bilateral sort of sanctions or tariffs don't work. So look at oil, for instance. We thought, oh, Russia's not going to be able to sell any oil. That's going to change the whole oil market. Well, obviously, they're still selling the oil, just not to us and not in the most straightforward ways. So the market supply has not really changed, right? What happens with semiconductors? So right now, everyone's assuming that, oh, well, we're all just going to build our own semiconductor capacity just to have it on hand. So India is spending billions, Japan is spending billions, the US is spending billions, even Europe is trying to spend billions to build some of their own stuff, on top of China, which is really spending tens of billions because they're desperate and they're scared. So what do you think is likely to happen when all of these countries are building billions and billions and billions of semiconductor capacity all at the same time, thinking that, well, it's not going to cause a problem because we're going to have these nicely, bifurcated supply chains, and India is just going to supply the United States, and China is going to supply itself, and Japan will, supply Korea. Like, obviously, it doesn't work that way. So what we're heading for is a massive overcapacity in semiconductors, like almost without fail. And that causes problems because then you have a bunch of countries sitting on overcapacity, sitting on sort of loss-making assets, or at least assets that aren't earning their cost of capital. And then, that magnified across many industries causes these sorts of broader scale problems.
I take your point on the currency thing not being near, but I think it's closer than you might think in terms of scenarios. So, I mean, imagine a scenario where, let's say Trump wins for the sake of argument. Let's say that he does some of these or enacts some of these policies that we're talking about with restrictive tariffs, not just on China, but on every single country in the world. Let's say inflation starts to go up at that point, and Trump starts to get more and more frustrated that nothing actually changes because the trade gets where it needs to go, and he's not actually driving down the U.S. deficit. If anything, the deficit continues to balloon like it did before. And meanwhile, U.S. employment now starts to creep up because the instability and the volatility from those policies results in people, companies wanting to cut back and people losing their jobs. And those angry people go out and start electing, protectionist-minded congressmen into the next midterm election. And now we start to have like the raw material for what happened in the 1920s, where you had a real move towards protectionism because people were angry, people were frustrated. Like, we're not there yet because the economy's running well, but it doesn't feel to me like we are so far from a scenario where you could go down that rabbit hole. So, I mean, like I said, a lot of those dominoes have to fall, and they haven't fallen, but you can sort of see it play out. It's striking to hear you talk about overcapacity in semiconductors because, I mean, NVIDIA is going to the moon, and semiconductors are the rising for what? NVIDIA is like worth more than the entire French stock market, I think was what I saw on Twitter the other day. So, I mean, how do you balance that? Because you want to be part of the mania a little bit, don't you? But at the same time, like you said, the writing is sort of on the wall. I don't know. Like, is that just a stay away? Like, or is it enjoy the ride now, but here's what to look for to get off the horse? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Again, it depends on everyone's time horizon and which strategy you're talking about. The one that makes the most sense in this context for us is our innovation strategy, which is sort of our core strategy that we've just rolled out for our long-term, wealth management clients. And the idea behind that is to own the assets that are harnessed to the technology revolutions that matter. So basically, if you have clients that realistically have a 20-year time horizon, you should invest along that 20-year time horizon. And what matters along a 20-year time horizon, it ain't, next quarter's earnings, it's societal level changes, which is, geopolitics is in its DNA, and technology revolutions. So if you were to go back to 1990 and say, what would matter for the next generation? It was the IT revolution, obviously. So that's how that strategy works. And we do have NVIDIA in that strategy on that time horizon, but sized very low right now relative to a full size position. Because what people forget is, especially in areas that are exciting, like AI and semiconductors, everyone's excited about them, is these are deeply, deeply cyclical markets. And that often gets lost in the mania. So just to put some numbers around it, right? So I'm bringing up NVIDIA on the Bloomberg here.
Mm-hmm.
In 2022, NVIDIA did $14 billion of sales, right?
Mm-hmm.
23, 11 billion. 24, 39 billion. This is fiscal 24. So this is, I'm sorry, calendar, the year that just ended. 39 billion. So they tripled the sales that they did 2 years ago. This coming year, the current estimate is 67 billion. So it went from 14 to 67 in 3 years, right? The year after that, estimate is 80. The year after that, the estimate is 90. Can you guess at what point in that series the analysts began plugging in a plus $10 billion a year number that marches steadily up off into the horizon? Yeah, like right after the year that they've currently given guidance for. So I don't know what the 2025 revenues for NVIDIA are coming up against that $67 billion number they're going to do this year, but it ain't going to be a step stair higher, 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 higher. That's just not how the industry works. It's probably going to be another one of these things where it goes down 30 or 40% because, oh my God, we built way too much capacity. GPU prices are collapsing. All of the AI startups that rush to raise capital have deployed it, and the business models are still uncertain, and the next wave isn't coming, and they've already trained their models, and now they just have inference, and oh my God, it's the telecom bust of 2002 all over again. That's a more plausible scenario than grow to the moon. And, that's not to say that 10 years from now, NVIDIA won't have, I don't know, 800 billion of revenues. That's plausible. I have no idea. But between here and there, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to buy it when everyone hates it. And this is this is not that time.
Yeah, that's the hardest part of everything. I want to bring it back for a second to something we've talked about on the podcast before, and it gets back to the Eau Claire thing, because I don't want people to think that just because the tire factory in Eau Claire closed down, that Eau Claire closed down, or that it's become sort of one of these deindustrialized sad cities, which there are plenty of them in the United States. But I joked about the horseradish thing. They are the world's largest grower and producer of horseradish. But also, like, Nestle's here and produces baby formula and a bunch of nutritional products here. There are companies that manufacture high-quality components for RV, marine, and automotive industries. Philips has a medical device manufacturer here. There's also, I think, Veritas Steel, I think, is a company that does, it's a bridge fabricator and things like that. So this is, it's a Wisconsin town of 60 to 70,000. But you can sort of, in that history that I gave of it at first, okay, it goes from furs to timber to tires, and now it's got its fingers in all these other things. And by the way, the food is also great. And we talked about this. I forget, it was that town in France that always seemed to reinvent itself, that it had some speciality in porcelain or something like that, and then it always specialized in something else. Like Eau Claire is not, it's not falling because the tire factory died. And I don't know, part of me wants to get into that micro geopolitics and say, oh, well, it's because there's access to the Mississippi River and the geography is very interesting, and the constellation of these sources means that there'll always be a wealthy sort of center here at this little part. But I don't know. I don't know if you have anything you want to riff on that, because we've talked about this a little bit, about how that kind of ingrained advantage, whether it's geographic or human-based or, knowledge-based and things like that, allows towns like this to reinvent themselves sometimes. And that seems to be the story here. That's how it feels in the street. Like, there are young people milling about on Water Street, like in the old, that used to be the factory and now has been turned into restaurants, and has, really high quality food that's coming from the dairies and the farms that are in the region, not to mention all the horseradish. So I take that in any direction you want, but I did want to sort of throw that in.
It kind of illustrates the difference between physical capital and human capital, I think, very well, because physical capital, as we said, gets stuck and it's hard to move, it's hard to change. Human capital is in your head, it's your skills, it's the culture around you, and that is by definition mobile and flexible and can be applied to new areas as they emerge, which is why it's much more powerful than physical capital. So take, I guess, two things. First, there's plenty of academic research showing that the places that are wealthy today, the cities, the geographic regions, have been wealthy for a shockingly long time. Whether you're looking at London or Florence or, any of these sort of enclaves, something about the human capital in those places endures even as things change. So, it was Limoges was the city you were thinking about, that was actually sacked, and most of the people were actually massacred during the Hundred Years' War with the English, and they came back and reinvented themselves 3 times in the course of 600 or 700 years in similar but different craft technologies. Like, that is human capital. And I think it is geopolitical in many ways. Like, look at Paris. Paris has always been the capital of what now is France, and has always been the dominant part of France, even when France was never unified. Well, look at the geography here. Like, going back to the Hundred Years' War, why did France survive? Well, it's because the English couldn't cross the Seine very easily. They had to try to get through Paris. They were blocked off. So, the Black Prince was taking his men, south through the middle part of the country there, because they had to go through Paris to get from one side to the other. It's a naturally dominant position. That island, if you zoom all the way into the 2 islands, where everyone who's been to Paris knows, where you have Notre Dame and, the 2 islands in the river, that is the heart of controlling the waterways and controlling the richest part of that country. So it always has been, and probably always will be, the heart of France, and where the human capital congregates and does well. And similarly for London, for similar reasons.
Well, London's actually an interesting case, because I did a very long essay on this back in the day at when I was at GPF. And London has been, for millennia, has been sort of the center of power for, England and eventually the United Kingdom. But it wasn't before the Romans got there. Like, London itself is really a Roman outpost, and it's what the Romans used to go and get all, I think, Hadrian's Wall is the one that goes all the way up to Scotland. But London emerges as a real seat of importance because it's where all of the local tribes start to bash against the Roman outpost that tries to bring England into the Roman Empire. And I mean, Rome sort of conquers parts of it. It's never really a full conquest in the way that parts of continental Europe are conquered. But ever since that moment, London has that place. But it's this interesting juxtaposition where it actually, there's nothing natural about London if you're just thinking about the geography of England or of the British Isles. It's about the external conqueror needed it and then built up all that infrastructure, and it became the center of everything that happened afterwards.
Yeah, so human capital endures, which is why, not to give too much away, but we have a lot planned to incorporate this in the services that we provide our wealth management clients, things around human capital in particular. But when you think about how important it is to educate your children and to provide them with the sort of upbringing that will put them in good stead and pass on your values and your knowledge, it can't be overestimated how important that is. And lest you think all this time spent messing around with your kids is time wasted, when you think about how that reverberates into generations. I mean, I think it's it shows you that it's not just wasting time, as a lot of people think it is.
Spoken like a young father, and I can tell you, I used to relish traveling as part of my work. I got to see different parts of the world and things like that. And it's great that I got to nerd out on Eau Claire and have one of the best cheeseburgers I've ever had in my life last night, and a spotted cow and everything else.
Oh, don't rub it in.
Man, I would rather be in my living room, like playing with Annie. Like, she's way more interesting than all of this nonsense. Before we leave, because that was a nice little rabbit hole that we went down, but there has been a lot happening in the world geopolitically, and I know some of you listen just to keep track on what's going on. So I don't think we'll go in any depth here, but some things that were on our knowledge platform this week that I think are interesting and you should know about. There's some China-Taiwan tensions that worry me. It looks like two Chinese idiots were driving a speedboat, and Taiwan tried to scare them off, and they ended up dying, and there's been some back and forth now between China and Taiwan. That's the recipe for the kind of thing that worries me with China and Taiwan, where it's not a state actor that's trying to do anything, but it was an accident, and you get into an escalatory spiral. So I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but that is something to have on your radar. We talked about some of the Chinese economic stuff. I thought the other big news was, major U.S. natural gas producers coming out and saying they're curtailing production. And you saw a real spike in natural gas prices. You put some things on the knowledge platform about oil in general. So we've had a couple head fakes here with oil and natural gas, but I did think it was interesting that you finally are seeing some data and some statements that are indicating that, maybe U.S. energy production has realized that if they keep doing this, they're just going to keep driving the price lower, and they can't keep doing that in general. And then, Rob, you had on here that Morocco's in crisis. Egypt is in a hyperinflation crisis. Like, so many places are in crises around the world. But worth saying that Red Sea shipping still not fixed. So I don't know. Do you want to talk about any one of those a little bit deeper, or do you want to say well, sayonara and we'll go in next week?
We can say sayonara and maybe go a little bit deeper on North Africa in particular at some point, because there's so much going on there that I find interesting. You mentioned Morocco. Egypt is in a much worse state than I assumed before I actually looked at it again. Like, they are really in trouble. So I think that's worth looking at, because that is, even if you think of wheat markets, Egypt is a massive consumer of imported wheat and a massive producer of wheat. So that's relevant to the audience, but also, just a whole bunch of stuff across North Africa I think is worth digging into in an episode soon. But yeah, we can save that on the back burner.
No,
for the
it
time
might
being.
be worth doing North Africa and the Middle East just in general away from the war, because the war and the Houthis are dominating the headlines. But you're right about Egypt. You're right about Morocco. The other interesting thing was that that I saw this week was that Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, which has been doing all these things like building all these strange boondoggles in the desert and all the stuff with the PGA Tour and getting Ronaldo, blah blah blah. Well, all that spending is finally coming home to roost, and the sovereign wealth fund, the value of the sovereign wealth fund has gone down by roughly 3/4. It's down to $15 billion, which is the lowest since December 2020. And we've sort of seen this before from the Saudis, where they spend a bunch of money, they start to run out of money, and then they freak out and move the opposite direction. So maybe we'll just have to put a magnifying glass not on the Middle East from the point of view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Red Sea shipping disruption, but what all these things mean in general for these countries, some of which have become the investment darlings of the Western world. I mean, certainly Saudi and all that Gulf money spends in the United States and other places. So maybe we'll pick it up there.
Well, I think the Saudis, I hear they're going to have to downgrade from Ronaldo to Nicholas Bentner for next season, the way things are going. So that would be quite a change.
I don't know enough about soccer to understand. So give me the basket. Are we downgrading from Michael Jordan to what?
No, Nicholas Bentner is like a retired, goofy former striker from Denmark. So he's no Ronaldo. That's the quick and dirty.
But is it like we're downgrading from Michael Jordan to like John Havlicek, like older, goofy, but was good, or is it like we're downgrading from Michael Jordan to like Isaiah Ryder?
I don't know if there's a great analogy. Nicholas Bentner is famous for pulling down his pants at the World Cup and showing a Paddy Power underwear. He was pretty good though. He was no Ronaldo, but he was decent.
He was no Ronaldo. I'm sure that'll be the epithet on his tombstone. All right, we'll see you out there.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.